Access to clean drinking water is considered a given that most Canadians take for granted, such as the easy access to clean drinking water from the taps in their house. The right to clean water is a basic human right and should be universal throughout Canada. However, this isn't the case of all Canadian citizens. Thousands of Aboriginal peoples who live on reserves do not have the luxury of turning the tap on for clean water. Many communities have lived under various degrees of drinking water advisories for years to even decades. More than 300,000 people who live in Indigenous communities do so under long-term boil water orders or a type of water advisory. The federal government, however, has committed to correcting this long-standing wrong by 2021. No power in choosing their location. So reserve lands are not strictly owned by bands, but are held in trust for bands by the Crown. The lack of government infrastructures, a lack of political will, and a lack of public solidarity has influenced the water crisis on reserves in Canada. The government is taking small steps in eradicating the water crisis on reserves in Canada. However, they need to be making faster strides in order to fulfill the promises they made regarding safe and clean water for Aboriginal peoples on reserves. The reality of various Indigenous communities' water issues surrounds the idea of brown bath water that leaves rashes and skin irritation, having to boil water to wash dishes, inadequate sanitation and wastewater disposal, and having to rely on bottled water to drink. So why are there an abundant amount of Indigenous communities in areas that are small, remote, and thus inaccessible to proper infrastructure? So Indigenous people in remote areas have greater ownership of land. They gain a range of cultural, social, and economic benefits from owning or controlling land. These benefits can include access to significant sites for cultural maintenance, customary activities such as hunting, fishing, and gathering, mining, realities, and other things. What power do band councils have to remedy the water crisis on reserves? So a band council is a basic unit of government for individuals that are subject to the Indian Act. They range from small to large group with band members. First Nation communities are usually represented by a band council that is run by an elected chief. Band councils are the governing body for Indigenous peoples within the community. The band council would have to either move funds from another program or ask Indigenous Affairs for more money in regards to remedy the water crisis on reserves. Money would need to be shifted overall from other places and be allocated to fixing the water crisis on reserves in Canada. So what are water advisories? Ontario has the highest number of drinking water advisories in the country. Water advisories are put in place to warn people not to drink the water because it is known to be unsafe or have the possibility to be harmful. Water advisories are put in place for various reasons, such as the water line breaks, equipment failure, or poor water filtration, as well as if there is no one trained to run the water system or to test the water quality. Water advisories can be placed either for short-term use or long-term use on the reserves in Canada. A water advisory can be issued if there are water line breaks, equipment failure, or poor water filtration, but also not just for those reasons, but if there is no one trained to run the water system or to test the water quality on a reserve. There are three kinds of water advisories. Boil water advisories is the first one. These types of advisories advise home users that they should allow their tap water to reach a certain level of heat around 1 minute before they use the water for any household activity. This advisory can be issued when there are problems with the water treatment system. The second type of water advisory is a do not consume advisory. These type of advisories are issued when the water system has contaminants that cannot be removed from the water by boiling it for several minutes. This water can only be used to shower older children and/or adults. The third type of water advisory is a do not use advisory. In no circumstance should the water be used by the residents for any reason. This advisory warns the public that the water poses a significant health risk if consumed. This water advisory is also issued when the water system has contaminants that cannot be removed by boiling and being exposed to the water boiling system and during various household activities. It can ultimately do much physical damage to an individual if consumed. The government's promise. The government has promised to lift short and long-term water advisories on the reserves. The funding and political will are slowly being implemented by the government in Canada. For the government to fulfill their promises they have made, they need to build more infrastructures as well as implement training on the reserves to uphold their promise to revoke short and long-term water advisories. The amount of collaboration and integrated training needs to be instilled within the reserves themselves to provide a short-term solution to the water crisis. Aboriginal communities do not receive the same education, training, and employment supports when it comes to water, science, and management as individuals off the reserves in Canada. Roles and responsibility. Roles and responsibilities regarding safe and accessible drinking water is dependent on the location. So first, on reserves out of the 60th parallel. First Nations government and the Government of Canada share responsibility within this location. Chiefs and councils manage the day-to-day water management on the reserves, and Indigenous Services Canada provides funding towards the water systems regarding this location. Indigenous Northern Affairs also helps to protect water quality and water management in the north. Second, in British Columbia, First Nations Health Authority has taken on the responsibility of providing independent public health advice and guidance to BC's First Nations communities. The Health Authority also provides funding in regards to the effective management of water on the reserves. In the territories, the territorial government is responsible for providing safe drinking water in all communities. The territorial government is also responsible for helping First Nations and Inuit communities. So overall, what is the government doing? So Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has promised to lift all long-term advisories, those that have been in place for more than a year in Aboriginal communities by March 2021. One of the major issues that is discussed surrounds the idea that the approval process for funding new First Nations water infrastructure is still far too complex and expensive for the government. Constitutional versus legal rights. So the legal rights are protected by regular law. However, of them, they can be altered or changed by the legislator through changing the law in Canada. However, constitutional rights, the constitutional right is protected and guaranteed by the Constitution, and they cannot be removed by any regular law enacted by the legislator. Specifically, these laws and rights are rights which are protected from government interference that is guaranteed by a Constitution. So CBC News article. So CBC News article, Ottawa's promise to fix First Nations water crisis is still falling short. This article discusses how the government needs to be able to allocate more resources to fulfill the promises in the budget they have set out to help fix the water crisis by 2021. However, by the research and papers done by the Davis Suzuki Foundation, they show how the government's promise to fix the water crisis on reserves by 2021 won't be anywhere near accomplished. Within the federal government, there are over 20 departments and agencies that have specific responsibilities to supply and adequately maintain fresh water for citizens around Canada. Specifically, when looking at clean water in reserves, the management of safe drinking water and wastewater in reserves is a shared responsibility between First Nations and the federal government. So the overall point regarding this news article is that the government can't just end long-term water advisories. They need to eradicate other broader issues that continue to perpetuate the crisis. Training, education, and employment supports need to be implemented by the government in the communities regarding water science and management. By failing to provide solutions to drinking water advisories affecting reserves, the government continues to perpetuate the nation's settler colonial ideology. Overall, the federal government has committed $41.8 billion in 2016 budget to deal with the water crisis on the reserves in Canada. However, looking at the CBC News article, it showcases that in 2017 it was discovered that only 75% of the budget was utilized towards the water crisis on reserves in Canada. So, in regards to the news article, there is a constitutional right to safe, clean, and accessible drinking water on reserves in Canada. Indigenous peoples have constitutional rights in regards to the right to life, liberty, and security of the person under Section 7 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom, as well as the right to equality under Section 15 of the Charter and government's obligation to provide significant public services of quality to all Canadians. Overall, Indigenous peoples have a legal claim against receiving proper, safe drinking water because it is a human right and they are Canadian citizens. So what are the responsibilities that are shared between the government and the First Nations government regarding safe drinking water? So programs and services for providing clean, safe, and accessible water on reserves are provided through various different sectors, such as First Nation band councils, Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada, and Health Canada, as well as the advisory role to INAC by Environment and Climate Change Canada. The province is a partner on a trilateral steering committee, which was established in September of 2016. This committee is made up of representatives from Chiefs of Ontario, political territorial organizations, Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada, and Health Canada. This committee is acting to eliminate over 48 long-term drinking water advisories that affect 26 Indigenous communities in Canada. The goal is to have them dealt with by April 2021. Not only does the committee want to ensure the elimination of these long-term drinking water advisories in Canada, but the committee also wants to make sure long-term sustainability is in place to prevent future advisories from coming into place after they are eliminated. As well, the Indigenous Drinking Water Projects Office was established to provide communities, resources, and expertise for on-reserve drinking water systems. Working collaboratively with communities in the federal government, the Indigenous Drinking Water Projects can do various things, such as undertake technical assessments of existing drinking water systems, including the water quality sampling, provide technical advice and support at every stage of the process for water quality improvement and the various projects, support and develop of sustainable operations and maintenance for plans regarding drinking water systems, as well as access and support water system operator training and certification requirements for individuals on the reserve. Indigenous Drinking Water Project is just one example of many that the government has partnered up with to start eliminating the long-term water advisories on reserves in Canada. The government and Indigenous Affairs. So in 2017, the government announced the creation of the Department of Indigenous Services Canada as a step towards renewing the relationship with Indigenous peoples. The federal government has planned to split the Ministry of Indigenous Affairs and Northern Affairs and create different departments in an effort to end the colonial structures and overall build stronger relationships with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples in Canada. By splitting the two sectors up, the government believes it will dismantle old structures that were designed in place to dominate and ultimately assimilate the Indigenous peoples in Canada. Caroline Bennett discussed this new split as stating the following. It is a story that is about decolonizing. It is about getting rid of the paternalism and being able to understand that we have to move in a new way of working together. It is about us stopping delivering government programs and begin to build Indigenous-led institutions and Indigenous-led governments. So that is how she believed this split would showcase to the world in Canada. This split is seen to be a recommendation of the Royal Commission of Aboriginal Peoples in a report that was submitted in 1996. Overall, the government hopes by the split that it will create a nation-to-nation partnership within Canada. Canada's new Department of Indigenous Services has taken responsibility for an additional 250 drinking water systems on First Nations reserves. The department has promises to eliminate them by March of 2021. Therefore, the federal government has now taken responsibility for more than 1,000 of the roughly 1,500 water systems on reserves. The water crisis in Canada is a huge issue, and it is a universal right that every single individual in Canada has access to clean, safe, accessible, and affordable drinking water, and this issue should be addressed and dealt with. Thank you.